You're welcome to the Economy and Politics Show. I'm Ottoabasi Abasiekong. This edition will discuss 1 year of the Tinubu administration and assessment of socio-economic developments. Joining me virtually for this conversation is Mr. Sule, the CEO of Renaissance Capital. It's nice to have you on the show.
And it's nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Let us begin with the consensus among economists and analysts that the Bola Tinubu administration needs an economic reforms program implementation plan. What is your take on this?
I think that's a relatively interesting concept because one can argue that we already have an economic reform plan. I think many of the questions are on the basis of the realities that we find ourselves in as Nigerians. We do see that there are various facets of the economy that need to be addressed, perhaps in a much more succinct manner. But whether they're being addressed or not is a question that we can almost argue that they are already being addressed. I think when you look through what has happened thus far economically, we've seen much more unified rates. We no longer talk around different exchange rates at this point in time. We have seen the impact of higher rates have an effect on the budgets of the national as state and local governments, which can be seen as a positive. And we've seen also a more conventional approach towards the economy. I think part of the rationale of parties waiting or looking for a new type of economic reform act is that there's a lot of pain on the streets, and that's very clear. I think from a monetary policy standpoint, under this current administration, there's been a move to more orthodox policy, and that orthodox policy has meant that there is a lot of orthodox policy being defined primarily as inflation targeting and stability within the economy has meant rates have had to move very high. It's essentially demand destruction. And that demand destruction is because of the amount of supply of currency that has come over the last few years. That is very clear. I think many parties are still awaiting the impact and proper pronouncements around fiscal policy. Those fiscal policy items, whether it be subsidies, of which some has been done, so we cannot remove from the fact that the mindset is clear, but that there are difficulties politically and perhaps socially around taxes. And I think most of us in corporate Nigeria have seen a renewed vigor around tax collection. Whether it's straightforward or not straightforward, that's still to be surmised in the future. Whether it's around reforming how the entire tax system works, and most importantly, refining government spending. I think the fact that some of these factors have still not been addressed in a manner that economists and economic participants fully understand is why the push for, or perhaps some of the noise around having a new economic reform program is. I think one thing I would state from your sentence is you did mention that economic reform program implementation plan, and I think the implementation is what many economists have looked at and have not perhaps seen, but we also understand some of the complexities of this. I think if you look through some of what has been discussed on the fiscal side, it does require some changes to the constitution in certain cases. Some call it revolutionary relook at things, and what we are essentially all clamoring for is for that to be done on a fast track pace, even more fast track, as we have what we would say is 18, perhaps 24 months, actually really 18 months of focus on delivering before we move into the next pre-election cycle.
All right, so Mr. Samuel, I hear you clearly, and yes, I know I said the economic reform program implementation plan. And again, that has to link with the budgets, the medium-term economic framework, and of course, the National Development Plan, which Yes, it's still ongoing. So from your perspective, how can this be achieved? Because we need a linkage between this implementation plan, the budgets, and of course the NTEF and the NDP, to the point that it can be measured. And also, economists believe that when you have an economic reform program implementation plan, you should have programs, policies, and projects so you can be able to track it. We also know that ministers last week were giving review of what they've done, but it's always simple to track when you have a coherent policy plan.
Well, I fully agreed with and I'll start from the last point you made, which is very clear. The ability to track government spending as well as revenues is very important. That's the basis of credibility. That's the basis of being able to hold our government into account. And I think there are certain instances where that's been the case in more measurable terms. And I think this is perhaps one of the reasons why the government is very supportive of the Sukuk program. And if you pass by many roads across the Federation, you will see the Sukuk as well as the number of the Sukuk, which shows a direct translation of funding into capital projects. That's very clear. And when we look at the link between the budget, the MTEF, as well as the NDEP, there is a link. However, many of those frameworks have a basis which is essentially evolved, and that's putting it kindly. When we look at the oil production numbers as per the MTEF, or we look at the inflation numbers as for the MTEF, they're very, very far from where we are. So the question is, does it require a revision? Does that revision come with a supplementary budget, for example? Or does it require just a tearing up and starting all over again? I think these decisions are not for us as economists or research parties or economic participants to define. They'll be politically defined as is with our system, but it is something that we have to continue to question. One example is the fact that on the exchange rate with regards to the MTEF for 2024 is 750 naira to the dollar. And it then drops from 2025 to 665.6. This is clearly not going to be the basis for any economic activity based on where we stand today. I think the other very clear points around that is with regards to oil production, a key factor in us becoming more sustainable from an economic standpoint and particularly from a debt standpoint. Again, there is a difference, a delta of what is close to 300,000 barrels plus that has thrown the economy in a very different light. I think the one positive is oil prices on the basis of demand as well as geopolitics remain much higher. But as long as we don't solve the other underlying parts of these very top line variables, it is very hard to create an economy that can be predicted. And with predictability comes additional investments from both internal as well as external parties. I think the other thing I would touch base on is the budget. And the budget, whether it be revenue numbers, of which CIT is a large part, and we have seen the impact of change in rates on profits of companies over 2023, whether it's with regards to oil revenues. Again, I spoke just earlier with regards to oil production, even though oil prices have maintained, whether it's with regards to independent revenues. There are questions there. And then, of course, on the other side, which is the expenditure side, debt service continues to go higher. And as we become more conventional, rates will essentially be looking to match inflation. And if inflation remains as it is, based on current conventional central bank policy, it means that the cost of servicing debt is going to become even more material. And as of 2024's budget, the deficit was supposed to be 9.2 trillion. And there is a risk of that overshooting, which then eats into capital expenditure, which then puts us on an unsustainable framework. All of this together means that there needs to be a revisioning of our economic reform plan, and not just from a monetary standpoint, but from a monetary and fiscal standpoint, taking into account the economic, the political, as well as the social variables.
Yeah, the whole alignment between monetary and fiscal. That's why we need foreign direct investments. I don't know how you feel, Mr. Sule, but we've seen instances where we've heard much about promissory investments. We've heard about potential investments. But I mean, just take two instances. Microsoft now committing $1 billion investment in Kenya. And of course, recently you heard the Total chairman talking about $6 billion investment in Angola, oil and gas. So Nigeria needs that predictable, stable policy environment. And for us to get those foreign direct investments, unlock economic opportunities and earn more revenue, this calls for alignment between fiscal and monetary policy authorities. How, so far, have you, from your assessment, do you see that alignment, again, in line with this whole yearning for economic reform program implementation? And of course, how can this be achieved if there are gaps already?
Thank you very much for that question. The first thing I'll say is change takes time, and change is not linear. That said, at Renaissance Capital Africa, we do quite a bit of work in the two economies that you've mentioned, Kenya and Angola. And we know why they're attractive. It's stable policies. It's extreme progressiveness. It's an openness to both domestic as well as international capital. And all of that unlocks that stability mixed with that openness and unlocks capital flows and essentially leads to economic growth. And that is essentially the objective of these governments. I think our government is no different in looking to unlock economic growth, where perhaps a bit more complicated as an institution, as an entity called Nigeria, but we're all achieving the same. We're all looking to achieve the same goals. I would think there's always a balance, and it's good you mentioned foreign direct investments, because there's a balance between foreign direct investments, foreign portfolio flows, as well as domestic
direct
investors, because domestic investors reinvest their proceeds in the country, and that's very clear. So if you look at, there's one example I do like to quote most times, the Middle East during COVID supported itself, and that's why was it able to do that? Because Middle Eastern investors have both Middle Eastern currency as well as dollars, and they're able to invest in their own societies. And we think that is perhaps the target of most governments, for them to be fully sustainable. Foreign direct investments do essentially prove that you are getting it right. And on a grand scale of looking through economic activity across various countries, you are being picked. But I think when you have a house, create your house to be comfortable and stable for you to start with. And then when the visitors come and they like it, and maybe you convert it into a hotel, they also want to stay. And it's really getting that balance together. Now, in terms of alignment between fiscal and monetary policy, I don't think either actor has an easy job. And I think on the monetary side, the central bank, in its independent fashion, is able to be conventional almost on the get-go, and we've seen that, and it's been a lot of steadying the ship, and that has been done relatively well from a monetary side. On the fiscal side is different. It's, again, mentioned, it's taxes, it's subsidies, and the impact socially and politically of that. It's also government spending, and there are various layers of government that are protected by the Constitution, and perhaps actors that cannot be controlled because in their own right they've been elected, and this is the objective or that they're looking to achieve. So they're perhaps a bit louder is going to be positive. Perhaps all of the plans that have been formulated over the last year can be brought forward, but we understand how complex it is, and we hope, or we expect as Nigerians, that over time these policies are announced and implemented, so we can start to see the gains from them. We've all taken pain, and we think that now is the time that we start to get to the crux of the matter and building an economy that's befitting of all Nigerians.
Yeah, taking the pain, and it's time to build on and ensure that we're going to get to the gains. And it's also argued that Nigeria needs to address the productivity issue in its policy path. Productivity is very critical. Even labor that's asking for wages there's the saying that, yes, if you're going to adjust wages, but you have to also look at productivity. But for you, what are the 5 top priority sectors that the Tinubu administration should really, really look at as key as we look at the remaining 3 years of this administration's tenure?
Sure. Thanks for that question once again. I think what is productivity is the ability for you and me to be able to make do in a much simpler way. And if we start, let's use a journey. And I always like going through the journey. You're an adult, you work somewhere. You start from your house. What do you need when you wake up? You need electricity. Stable power is very clear. Well, with electricity and clean water, you have a bath, you make some breakfast, you say goodbye to your family, and then you get on the road. On the road, what do you need? Good roads and good transportation. Very, very clear again. Use the road, you get to your office. At your office, you need electricity. Or whilst you're going through work, you need a stable environment, an environment that's predictable with rule of law. So when you transact with Mr. B and Mr. C, very clearly you know that the law is on your side as long as you are within the confines of rules and regulations and the legal system. It enables you act much more, and the velocity of growth increases. In between, you would have colleagues who will also share your experiences and whatnot in dealing that. Maybe you want to go, you want to go to other states to explore various opportunities. That also requires that same transportation link. You finish work, you want to get back home. Again, it's the transport system, it's energy, it's water, it's rule of law. Those are the basics of every economy. And over time, that would lead to a consolidation of savings, a consolidation of investments, and an ease of life that makes life much more pleasant. And we think the basics running through these, a basic day in the life of anybody or the life of a Nigerian is what should be addressed at the point in time. One thing I didn't mention there, which is extra critical, is the fact that when this gentleman or gentlewoman leaves their house, they also have children. Their children also need to be educated in a safe environment. So security, of course, and education do then join those top priority sectors.
So energy, transportation, security, education, very critical. Of course, agriculture, because you talked about food. I mean, agro.
That's correct.
Yeah. So those are key sectors that we need to see a lot of focus that can also unlock opportunities and create more jobs, which again brings to that the need for that coherent implementation economic plan, which everyone, including you, Mr. Sule, and your team, can look at and always give the assessment, which brings me to the question as we begin to wrap up. From the rank up point, from your point, what's the outlook like for the remaining half of the year 2024? What an eventful year we've had. Of course, we're entering the second half now.
And we do think that at some point there will be a supplementary budget, and that will define. And what we are aware of is on the monetary side, rates are where they are to not match inflation and lead to a real return, but to at least make the negative real return less. That's very clear. We are aware of the government's borrowings, which should lead to a boost of the economy, but we see those as bridges. Whether it's the Afrexim facility, which we're now aware has been completed, whether it's the plan to access bond markets in dollars locally and perhaps also internationally. We think all of that bolsters reserves and gives us capital to essentially restructure the economy in the right way and lead to sustainable growth. And we're also aware of the other side of that, which is the debt service is going to continue to increase. And that's going to take away from what are limited resources in dealing with some of these economic policies and economic prospects. On the basis of that, it's hard to tell or to call. We have seen a few green shoots. There are a few other shoots that we are watchful of. I think the key one is oil production. because that is our biggest source of dollars into the economy. And the sooner oil production gets at least to the OPEC quota, and that's really for exports, because we're starting to have more refineries onshore, and we can always use that for domestic consumption, the better the economy would fare, and the more sustainable it would be. At this point in time, we've not seen many of those. And so we're watchful, and we'll be guided by these announcements as they happen. And we'll remain watchful of what the political economic actors do over the next month or two.
Yes, and also economist Mr. Sule have also added the fact that there's also need to look at equity, where you turn your assets into wealth. That you know what you own, and from knowing what you own, you can turn into wealth, like Saudi Arabia, for example, your state oil company, valuing it and then taking it to the market, get some equity from it, and that unlocks capital, like you rightly said, and some various other huge assets, learning from what America, India, and Saudi Arabia has done. Also, the issue of institutional reforms is top on what some economists are also mentioning, and also the need for, like you've raised today, policy stability, predictability, and that helps again for investments and the pathway.
One point on that is the government, I mean, the MOFI has been reinstituted in its current form.
Yes.
And that institution is one that we expect to see a lot of change from, because now you have a private sector mindset manning the assets of the government. And we think that's a very important institution as we move forward, and one that would lead potentially, with the right focus, to stronger economic growth.
Yes, the MOFI. So MOFI will be one institution to keep tabs on into the second half of the year. But it's been a very interesting conversation with you, Mr. Samuel Sule, CEO of Renaissance Capital. It has been, of course, a good way to assess this administration's 1 year. Of course, there have been pains and gains in some way, but it's very important, like you rightly said, we have stable policy framework, and we begin to see the key sectors you've highlighted: transportation, energy, agriculture, education, security, given those prior focus, so that we can begin to have that stability and a lot more economic opportunities. Thank you once again for the time, and we hope to have you subsequently on our show to discuss economic developments. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. Pleasure. To our viewers, if you want to get further insights on this conversation, visit the ProShare website displayed on the screen and follow our social media platforms to engage further on this show. To become your way again, enrich yourself with the knowledge of socio-economic developments around you, because it is a wise thing to do. I'm Ottoabasi Abasiekong. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.